Some ideas are so dangerous they get you killed.
Socrates, you would not be tolerated for long.
Others are so powerful they kill entire belief systems.
Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent.
From Socrates' death to Wittgenstein's devastating discovery, here are 6 times philosophers started revolutions that shattered our world as we knew it and changed everything. The death that birthed Western philosophy, starting with the most consequential execution in intellectual history, initiated by a 70-year-old philosopher who refused to stop asking questions. Socrates once said, "I know that I know nothing." But this wasn't philosophical humility. It was a declaration of war against the entire Athenian establishment. Athens, 399 BC. The Golden Age was crumbling. The Athenians had lost the Peloponnesian War, democracy was in chaos, and the city desperately needed scapegoats. Enter Socrates, a man who'd spent 30 years wandering the agora, approaching politicians, priests, and poets with one devastating question. What do you really know? For decades, Socrates had perfected a devastating technique. He'd approach Athens' most respected citizens, generals, poets, politicians, and ask seemingly innocent questions. What is courage? He'd ask a war hero. What is beauty? To a renowned artist. Then came the follow-ups, each question exposing contradictions until these powerful men stood speechless, their expertise crumbling under scrutiny. The elite were often left feeling like fools in front of crowds. The final straw came with Anytus, a wealthy politician and leather merchant. In a philosophical discussion with a group of influential Athenians, Socrates questioned whether traditional Athenian leaders could actually teach virtue to their sons, directly challenging the legitimacy of the ruling class Anytus represented. Anytus, who was in this group, took offense at Socrates' words and stormed off with barely concealed threats. He'd had enough of Socrates undermining the entire system that gave Anytus his power and status. On a spring morning in 399 BC, Socrates was dragged before 501 Athenian citizens and charged with corrupting the youth and impiety against the gods. This was Athens' chance to silence their gadfly. Socrates could have apologized, paid a fine, slipped into exile. Instead, he doubled down. When asked to propose his own punishment, he suggested Athens should give him free meals for life, as a public benefactor. The jury erupted. With a difference of just 30 votes, they sentenced him to death. Friends begged him to escape. Crito had bribed the guards. A boat waited at Piraeus. But Socrates refused. One must never do wrong, even when wronged, he said. He drank the hemlock, spent his final hours discussing the immortality of the soul, and died still asking questions. That death created a martyr whose method, relentless questioning of assumptions, became the foundation of Western philosophy. Plato, watching his teacher die, dedicated his life to preserving Socratic wisdom. Without that execution, systematic philosophy as we know it might never have existed. The controversial act against the Church. Much like how Socrates challenged Athens' certainties, Galileo Galilei shattered humanity's most fundamental assumption about our place in the universe. But this revolution came with a telescope and mathematical proof. For 1,400 years, everyone knew Earth sat motionless at the center of God's creation. Aristotle had proven it, Ptolemy had mapped it, and the Catholic Church had made it doctrine. This wasn't just astronomy, it was theology. Earth at the center meant humans were God's central creation. Then, in 1609, a 45-year-old mathematics professor in Padua heard about a Dutch invention, a spyglass that made distant objects appear closer. Galileo didn't just buy this telescope, he built a better one. 20 times magnification instead of 3 times. On January 7, 1610, he pointed it at Jupiter and saw something impossible. 4 moons orbiting the planet. If Jupiter had moons, then not everything revolved around Earth. His book, Sidereus Nuncius, Starry Messenger, became an instant bestseller, selling out its first printing in a week. The Church initially celebrated Galileo's discoveries because his observations of Jupiter's moons, lunar mountains, and other stellar discoveries were seen as amazing revelations of God's creation. Pope Paul V received him warmly in 1611. But when Galileo began explicitly advocating for heliocentrism as fact rather than hypothesis, thereby challenging the geocentric model that was tied to church doctrine, the Catholic Church frowned on this and tried to handle it quietly. Cardinal Bellarmine warned Galileo not to hold or defend heliocentrism as fact, though he could discuss it as a mathematical hypothesis. For 16 years, Galileo played by these rules. Then his friend became Pope Urban VIII, and Galileo thought he had protection. That assumption was his fatal mistake. In 1632, Galileo published Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, supposedly presenting both sides fairly. But the book was clearly pro-heliocentric. And worse, it seemed to mock the Pope by putting his arguments in the mouth of a character named Simplicio, the simpleton. Urban VIII felt publicly humiliated. The Inquisition summoned Galileo to Rome. At age 69, facing torture and death, he was forced to kneel and recant, "I abjure, curse, and detest the aforesaid errors and heresies." Galileo's books were exiled to the Index of Forbidden Books. Galileo spent his final years under house arrest, but the damage was done. His telescopic observations couldn't be unseen. Within a century, Newton's laws explained exactly how planets orbit the sun. The Church quietly removed Galileo's works from the Index of Forbidden Books in 1758, and in 1992, 359 years later, Pope John Paul II formally admitted the Church's error. Galileo's revolution didn't just move Earth from the center of the universe, it established that empirical observation trumped religious authority in understanding the natural world. The dangerous idea that wouldn't die. While Galileo moved Earth from the center of space, Charles Darwin removed humanity from the center of creation itself. This revolution began not with a telescope, but with a 5-year voyage and a secret 20 years in the making. Victorian England, 1859. Divine creation wasn't just religious doctrine, it was scientific consensus. William Paley's natural theology had convinced everyone that complex life required an intelligent designer. His famous watchmaker analogy argued that just as a watch implies a watchmaker, the complexity of living organisms implies a divine designer. Even Darwin himself was studying to become a clergyman at Cambridge when he boarded HMS Beagle in 1831 as a 22-year-old naturalist. On September 15, 1835, Darwin landed on the Galapagos Islands. What he saw changed everything. Finches with different beak shapes perfectly adapted to each island's food sources, mockingbirds that varied by location. Were these separate acts of creation, or were species somehow changing? Back in England, reading Malthus's essay on population competition, Darwin had his eureka moment. Nature was selecting survivors. For 20 years, Darwin developed his theory in private. He knew it was explosive. He called it his murder confession. If humans evolved from animals, what happened to the soul? To humanity's divine purpose? He told friends it felt like confessing to murder. In 1858, disaster struck. Alfred Russel Wallace sent Darwin a manuscript describing nearly identical ideas. Panicked about being scooped, Darwin rushed to publication. On November 24, 1859, his book called On the Origin of Species hit bookstores. All 1,250 copies sold out on the first day. The reaction was explosive. Bishop Samuel Wilberforce organized the famous Oxford debate of 1860, mockingly asking Thomas Huxley, Darwin's avid supporter, whether he was descended from apes on his grandfather's or grandmother's side. Huxley shot back that he'd rather have an ape for an ancestor than a man who used his intellect to obscure truth." The audience gasped. One woman fainted. But the evidence was overwhelming. Within a decade, most scientists accepted evolution. Darwin hadn't just challenged religious doctrine, he'd removed purpose from nature itself. Evolution had no goal, no divine plan. It was simply what worked, survived. This dangerous idea, as philosopher Daniel Dennett later called it, became the foundation of modern biology and transformed our understanding of humanity's place in the natural world. We're still grappling with its implications today. The madman's prophecy. Darwin showed that humans evolved from animals, but Friedrich Nietzsche went further. He declared that our entire moral framework was an evolutionary mistake. This revolution began with the most dangerous philosophical pronouncement of the 19th century. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. Germany, 1882. Christian morality had dominated European culture for over a millennium. Concepts like sin, guilt, humility, and self-sacrifice were considered eternal truths. Enter Friedrich Nietzsche, a brilliant classical philologist who'd been appointed professor at Basel at just 24, but chronic illness and philosophical restlessness had driven him to resign and wander Europe as a solitary thinker. In his book, The Gay Science, Nietzsche introduced the madman who runs through the marketplace with a lantern in broad daylight, searching for God. When mocked by atheists, the madman declares, "God is dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers?" This wasn't celebration. It was a terrifying diagnosis. According to Nietzsche, science and reason had made God irrelevant, but nobody understood the consequences. Nietzsche's subsequent works, Beyond Good and Evil, On the Genealogy of Morals, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, systematically dismantled Christian ethics. He argued that good and evil weren't divine commands but human inventions. Christianity, he claimed, had created slave morality. Values like humility, self-sacrifice, and pity were actually tools used by the weak to control the strong. What humanity needed was the Übermensch, not a master race, but individuals who could create their own values in a godless world. Nietzsche saw what was coming. If traditional foundations collapsed without replacement, Europe would descend into nihilism and chaos. He predicted the 20th century's catastrophes: 2 world wars, totalitarianism, spiritual emptiness. His will to power wasn't about domination, but about the fundamental drive to create meaning in a meaningless universe. Nietzsche's mental collapse in 1889 seemed to prove his critics right, that his philosophy led to madness. Nietzsche suffered a complete mental collapse and spent his final 11 years in madness. But Nietzsche's core insight survived. If God is dead, we must become our own creators of value. Existentialists like Sartre and Camus, psychologists like Freud, postmodernists like Foucault, all built on his foundation about creating meaning in a godless universe. Even today, debates about moral relativism, authentic living, and individual responsibility trace back to Nietzsche's terrifying question. In a world without predetermined meaning, how do we create lives worth living? The spectre that haunted Europe. While Nietzsche diagnosed the death of God, Karl Marx performed an autopsy on capitalism itself. His revolution began in the reading room of the British Museum and ended up reshaping half the world. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. London, 1867. The Industrial Revolution had created unprecedented wealth and unprecedented misery. Factory workers labored 16-hour days for subsistence wages, while owners accumulated vast fortunes. Most economists considered this natural and inevitable. Enter Karl Marx, a German exile with a philosophy PhD who'd been driven from Prussia for his radical views, now surviving in poverty while studying capitalism in the British Museum. Marx's book, Das Kapital, was devastating because it was scientific, not emotional. He showed that capitalism's profits came from surplus value. Workers might create $100 worth of goods, but only be paid $50, with capitalists pocketing the difference. This wasn't exploitation by evil individuals, but the system's inherent logic. Competition forced capitalists to maximize profits by minimizing wages, creating what Marx called the iron law of accumulation. Marx argued that material conditions like who controls production drive all historical change. History was class struggle, masters versus slaves, lords versus serfs, now capitalists versus workers. Capitalism was progressive. It had unleashed incredible productive power, but it was also self-destructive. It would concentrate wealth, create a massive, impoverished working class, and eventually collapse under its own contradictions. Marx's ideas spread through Europe's working classes like wildfire. The Paris Commune of 1871 terrified ruling classes. Workers had actually seized power, if only briefly. Socialist parties formed across Europe, with Germany's Social Democratic Party becoming the world's largest by 1914. The spectre Marx had described in 1848 when he said, "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism," was becoming real. The Russian Revolution of 1917 proved Marx's ideas could topple empires. Within decades, roughly a third of humanity lived under governments claiming to follow Marx's blueprint. Communist movements controlled China, Cuba, Vietnam, and half of Europe. Even capitalist countries adopted socialist policies, welfare states, labor unions, progressive taxation to prevent revolution. Marx's prediction that capitalism would inevitably collapse hasn't materialized, but his influence persists. His focus on economic power structures, class conflict, and capitalism's instability continues to shape economics and politics. Modern debates about wealth inequality, automation, and universal basic income all echo Marx's fundamental insight. Economic systems are not natural laws, but human creations that can be changed, by revolution if necessary. The genius who ended the game. While Marx rebuilt economics from the ground up, Ludwig Wittgenstein made a bewitching discovery. He suggested that most philosophical problems were linguistic confusions that would dissolve once we understood how language actually works. Philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language, said Ludwig Wittgenstein. Cambridge, 1921. Bertrand Russell and other logical positivists believed they could solve all philosophical problems using mathematical logic. Language, they thought, mirrored reality's logical structure. Enter Wittgenstein, heir to one of Austria's wealthiest families who'd switched from engineering to philosophy after discovering Russell's work on mathematical logic. Wittgenstein was brilliant, tortured, and utterly uncompromising. Russell called him the most perfect example I have ever known of genius as traditionally conceived. Writing largely in World War I trenches, Wittgenstein published Tractus Logico-Philosophicus, a slim book claiming to solve all philosophical problems forever. The book claimed that reality consisted of facts, language of propositions that pictured those facts. Everything else, ethics, aesthetics, religion, lay beyond language's limits. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent, he proclaimed. Convinced he'd finished philosophy, after the war, Wittgenstein quit academia and became an elementary school teacher in rural Austria. But in the 1930s, Wittgenstein returned to Cambridge with a shocking admission. His earlier philosophy was completely wrong. Language wasn't a picture of reality, it was a toolkit for human activities. Words got their meaning not from logical structure, but from use in particular contexts, what he called language games. His posthumous Philosophical Investigations, 1953, was revolutionary. The word game itself had no essential definition. Chess, football, and Ring Around the Rosie were connected only by family resemblances. If meaning comes from use, then traditional philosophical questions like what is knowledge or what is justice were based on false assumptions. They assumed these words had eternal essences waiting to be discovered. Philosophy's job wasn't to discover grand truths, but to cure conceptual confusions, showing how language was running on holiday, being used outside its normal contexts. This therapeutic approach influenced ordinary language philosophy and transformed how we think about meaning itself. The paradox: Wittgenstein created a unique revolution. Instead of providing new answers, he suggested that most philosophical questions were pseudo-problems. He spent his career trying to show that philosophy was mostly pointless, but ironically he did philosophy more profoundly than almost anyone else. In attempting to end philosophy, he transformed it completely. The revolution continues, from Socrates' questions that birthed Western thought to Wittgenstein's insights that transformed it. These 6 revolutions show philosophy's power to reshape reality itself. Each thinker faced established authority, risked everything for dangerous ideas, and changed how we understand ourselves and our world. But the revolution isn't over. Today's philosophers grapple with artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, climate change, and digital consciousness. Questions that would have amazed even these revolutionary minds. The method remains the same. Question everything, follow the argument wherever it leads, and never stop asking why. Because as Socrates knew 2,400 years ago, the unexamined life is not worth living, and the unexamined world is not worth inhabiting. The real question is not whether machines think, but whether men do. B.F. Skinner. The revolution continues. The questions remain. And somewhere, a new philosopher is preparing to shatter everything we think we know.